schemes we looked at. But this time we dug in our heels and came back and said, no, this is the right way to do it. This is the best we can do. Called for a meeting of the National Security Council on the subject. Got the meeting, and to make a long story short, it was approved.
At the time that I made the decision to build the MX,
on September 7th, 1979, President Carter announced that 200 MX missiles would be built and deployed in a complex of 4,600 shelters in the West.
To survive an attack. It's a system that America needs and will have for its security. I'm confident that the American people will support this deployment.
Finally, the MX was on its way. The Air Force began surveying the deserts of Utah and Nevada to prepare for deployment, pleased it would at last get its big, accurate missile. And those more concerned with missile vulnerability were happy the MX would be hidden in over 40,000 square miles of desert, safe from attack. The experts and the politicians were on board. Now the MX was to meet the American people.
Well, the one MX site or cluster or pod or whatever we choose to call it would have been built just beyond this black cinder cone there is on the horizon there. And of course it would have been just that close in proximity to the ranch, and then the railroad would have been built up entirely up the valley, coming out on up the valley here.
Cecil Garland, a veteran of World War II, ranches in western Utah.
As we're drilling a series of
He attended one of the earliest meetings at which the Air Force explained their plans to the local people.
To the levels and the actifers.
You know, I haven't seen so much brass since the Battle of the Bulge. They're going to come hell or high water, and they don't care what they're going to do to my desert where I live. It's an invasion, an encroachment law. And I can't talk to these people.
A lot of people here tonight, I think, believe it is a foregone conclusion that no matter what they say or do, MX will be built in Utah, even if there is opposition from the people.
Well, the ultimate decision to deploy MX is certainly a national decision, which will take into account the feelings and the attitudes of the people in the deployment area.
And of course he kept, telling us that this was good for us. And in spite of all our suspicions, concerns, and worries and cares about our land, our water, our ranches, and the valleys, and our way of life, still, this was good for us. And just relax and enjoy it. And the more that they tried to reassure us, I guess the more concerned and suspicious we came.
I'm Major Bill Clapper of the Ballistic Missile Office.
Most of the local opposition focused on environmental and social concerns, but the more the system itself and the way it was supposed to work was explained, the less the people liked it. An Air Force film didn't help.
So to be sure of destroying that one missile and its 10 deadly warheads, an attacker will have to destroy all of its shelters. That means a minimum of 23 of their most accurate warheads to destroy only one missile. And the MX force will have 200 missiles.
If the Utah people didn't like 4,600 warheads pointed their way, they were also suspicious of the MX itself.
MX was not a defensive weapon. It was a first strike weapon. And we know this was so because it had terrible accuracy. The military said that it had surgical accuracy, whatever that is.
There's a paradox in the idea of an accurate, survivable missile. Suppose it did survive a Soviet first strike. What would its targets be? The silos the Soviets launched their strike from would now be empty. And if there were missiles left, Soviet commanders would certainly have their fingers on the button in anticipation of any U.S. counterattack.
Stop MX! Stop MX! Stop MX!
It seemed to the growing band of MX opponents that the elaborate basing mode for the MX was window dressing to hide the real purpose of the missile, to strike first against the Soviet Union.
Stop MX!
Live from Symphony Hall in Salt Lake City,
The MX debate went national in early 1980 when Bill Moyers chaired a live 2-hour debate on public television. There were panels of experts and 4 local citizens, including Cecil Garland.
Would you like to put to any one of these 3?
I had the statistics about land and water and cattle and grazing and all wrote down, and I was going to talk about that. But the more I heard from the world's great experts on how to kill millions and millions and millions of the people of this earth with the least cost and expense and the most efficiently, I guess I sort of became repelled by the whole idea, and I just threw my statistics away, and I said, it seems to me that this discussion has degenerated into how we should deploy the missile of the 3 modes.
The land mode or the sea mode or the air mode. And I'd like to suggest 4th mode. I call it the COM mode.
To the dismay of the Air Force, its carefully crafted plan for the MX was becoming a national joke.
Cecil.
In an attempt to make the scheme a little more practicable, the need for the missile to dash at high speed between shelters was eliminated. Instead, a more stately but still immense transporter would move the missiles between shelters. But because the shell game could now be played only slowly, it was more important than ever to keep the real location of the missile secret.
We looked at every possible espionage method that the Soviets could use, from satellites to agents riding around the desert in Winnebagos, crammed with electronic gear. And in fact, the Air Force had done the same thing and had decided to, instead of leaving the shelters that didn't have an MX missile empty, instead they were going to put a dummy in. That dummy, the official name for the dummy was a mass simulator. And so in each cluster of 23 shelters, there would be 1 MX missile and 22 mass simulators. And what we found is that gradually we learned that you had to make that mass simulator look more and more like a missile. You had to, for example, paint it with the right paints, because paints have an odor that can be detected with chemical sensors, and so forth, so that this thing smelled, looked, tasted, and behaved in all ways like an MX missile. And that was pretty complicated and I guess ultimately got rather bizarre.
Most of the complications arose from the proposed SALT II requirements that the Soviets be able to verify how many missiles the U.S. possessed. SALT II was anathema to most conservatives, who were then rallying around the presidential candidacy of Ronald Reagan. One of Reagan's major campaign issues was the window of vulnerability.
We have let our ability to defend ourselves be reduced to the point that there is what the military now calls a window of vulnerability through which that imperialistic power could one day issue an ultimatum.
But while Reagan campaigned on the window of vulnerability, he was cool on the Carter administration's solution to it.
The plan that has been submitted is going to, if I understand it correctly, require about 4,000 miles of tunnels and trenches in which those...
And tracks.
Yes, in which those missiles would maneuver. That seems a kind of a Rube Goldberg idea to begin with. Tremendously costly and can't be implemented for quite a number of years.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
January 1981, and again the MX was in the balance.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Carter had chosen a missile system with the emphasis on survivability and SALT II compliance. But by now, SALT II was declared dead. And to Reagan, the Carter basing plan seemed likely to deny the nation the MX's extra nuclear clout for too long. Because through all the debate on where to put it, the missile itself had been progressing well. All 4 stages of the missile were successfully tested. And development of the warheads and guidance system was also on schedule. So why not cancel the Carter basing scheme and come up with something simpler that could get the MX into service more quickly? Ironically, the Air Force, which had originally championed exactly this view, now grew seriously alarmed.
We felt that we had forged a fragile but still workable consensus in the Congress and among the people in the states that were affected and among all of the strategic thinkers who had gone through all of the agonizing lists